January 1st, New Year's morning in the Caribbean. At 6:12 local time, the sea is calm, visibility is crystal clear, and the horizon looks exactly the way sailors want it to look on the first sunrise of a new year. The water is flat, the wind is light, and there is no bad weather and no heavy civilian traffic. Ahead, a U.S. Navy carrier strike group moves steadily through international waters on a routine, fully lawful transit. This is not a sudden deployment and not a dramatic demonstration. It is scheduled, documented, and ordinary by naval standards. Flight activity is limited. Sensors are running, but the overall posture is calm. Then the situation changes without warning. On the surface search radar, 5 new contacts appear within minutes of one another. They are not spread out randomly. They are moving together. Their speed is consistent and their bearing looks intentional. Inside the Combat Information Center, the contacts are flagged immediately. These are not merchant ships. They are not Coast Guard vessels. They are Venezuelan naval ships. The contacts are confirmed both visually and electronically. Their hull shapes match known Venezuelan surface combatants. Their courses are plotted. The closest point of approach is calculated, and the numbers do not suggest coincidence. Instead of keeping their distance, the Venezuelan ships begin to alter course. At first, the changes are small, 5 degrees then 10, but enough to matter, enough to start closing the space. This is not simple shadowing. This is positioning. This is geometry meant to get in the way. From the bridge of the U.S. warship positioned at the edge of the strike group, the watch team recognizes it immediately. No one shouts. No one loses composure. The response is professional, disciplined, and automatic. Maintain speed, maintain course, record everything. Radio calls go out on international maritime channels in both English and Spanish, identifying the U.S. Navy formation and its lawful passage. The message is calm, clear, and exactly by procedure. There is no reply. The Venezuelan ships continue on the same path. At this range, every mile matters. Every knot matters. On the plotting table, the geometry tightens. The closest point of approach drops from double digits into single digits. No alarms are sounding, and no one is making a spectacle of the moment, but the posture shifts. Surface radar moves into a higher detail mode. Electro-optical systems begin tracking each ship individually. Emissions are logged, bearings are time-stamped. Every second is recorded. This is where gray zone encounters happen. Not in dramatic flashes, but in narrow margins and short windows of time. Now the 5 Venezuelan ships form a loose arc ahead of the carrier strike group. Not quite a wall, at least not yet, but enough to complicate movement and make the message unmistakable. They are close enough to be seen with the naked eye, and still they remain silent. No radio calls, no explanation, no acknowledgement. For the U.S. Navy, silence is information. It tells you the move is deliberate. Inside the strike group, commanders are evaluating intent, not emotion. Venezuela cannot match the power in front of it. They know that, and so does everyone else. Which means this is not about prevailing in a direct clash. It is about provoking a response. Blocking without openly crossing the line is a classic pressure tactic. It creates danger without triggering an immediate larger crisis. It challenges the other side to react too sharply, to maneuver too aggressively, to be the first one seen as escalating. But the carrier strike group does not flinch. The formation stays on its line. Because in moments like this, the first side to lose discipline also loses control of the story. Minutes pass, the Venezuelan ships refine their positions. One vessel creeps slightly forward, probing the spacing. Another adjusts speed, trying to tighten the angle of approach. Every move is calculated. Every move is documented. Above the surface, there is no shouting, no visible chaos, no theatrical display. But behind the scenes, sensors are fully alert, and command teams are already thinking several steps ahead. This is not the first time the U.S. Navy has seen this kind of tactic, and it will not be the last. What matters now is not who appears more aggressive. What matters is who stays steady. Because once an attempt to block a formation begins, there are only 2 possible outcomes. Either the carrier strike group turns away, or someone discovers very quickly that a line of steel hulls is not enough to stop forward motion. And that realization may be much closer than Venezuela expects. At 6:24 local time, the geometry tightens again. The 5 Venezuelan warships are no longer lingering at the outer edge of the radar picture. Their movements begin to converge with clear purpose. Small course changes build into a pattern that any experienced surface warfare officer would recognize immediately. This is controlled interference. One ship moves slightly ahead of the others, offset just enough to affect the carrier strike group's forward path. 2 more slide outward, widening the shape of the obstruction. The remaining pair stay a little farther back, positioned to close the gap if the formation reacts. No individual move appears openly aggressive on its own. Together, they create pressure. The closest point of approach drops once more. From the U.S. perspective, this is the most dangerous stage of any gray zone encounter. Not because weapons are involved, but because miscalculation is. Radio calls are repeated, clear, professional, and fully logged. Still, there is no response. The Venezuelan ships are close enough now that deck crews can be seen through long-range optics. No weapons are visibly manned, no flags are raised, no signals are passed, only movement. Inside the Combat Information Center, watch teams update the surface plot in real time. Bearings, speed, rate of closure, every variable is tracked and recorded. Nothing is guessed. Intent is judged only by behavior, and the behavior leaves little room for doubt. This is not shadowing, this is not escorting. This is an effort to shape the strike group's movement. The strike group does not slow down. It does not alter course, because that is exactly the reaction this tactic is meant to provoke. A sharp turn would create a story. A speed change could be framed as withdrawal. Either one would hand the narrative to the other side. So the response is restraint, visible, deliberate, and absolute. As the range continues to close, U.S. sensors quietly step up. Surface radar shifts to tighter resolution. Electro-optical systems begin tracking individual hull numbers. Electronic support measures listen closely, cataloging every emission, every radar sweep, every brief transmission between the Venezuelan ships. The silence from the other side becomes its own kind of signal. It confirms command and control. It confirms coordination. It confirms that this encounter was prepared, not improvised. The lead Venezuelan ship inches closer, narrowing the lateral separation. Its wake lengthens, a sign of increased throttle. Seconds later, another vessel mirrors the move. The blocking arc compresses. To an untrained observer, it might look subtle. To professional crews, it is unmistakable escalation. Still, no alarms sound. The carrier strike group's posture appears unchanged, but readiness quietly tightens. Aviation assets are moved to short notice. Helicopter crews receive updated briefs. Cameras continue recording. Legal and operational documentation moves forward in parallel. This is the modern maritime arena where evidence can matter just as much as strength. The Venezuelan tactic is straightforward. Apply enough pressure to force a deviation without crossing the line that would justify a stronger response. But pressure works both ways. The closer they come, the more information they reveal. Their maneuvering patterns, spacing discipline, response timing, and command cohesion, all of it is being captured. At 6:33, one Venezuelan ship slips slightly out of alignment. Just a few degrees, just for a moment, but enough to expose a seam in the formation. It is subtle, yet immediately noticed. That small break reveals something important. This is not a hardened blockade. It is a demonstration, and demonstrations have limits. The U.S. formation continues forward without disruption. No new warnings are issued beyond the standard radio calls. No dramatic gestures are made. The message is delivered through consistency alone. You do not control this space, you do not dictate movement, and you do not determine the outcome. The minutes drag on. Now the Venezuelan ships face a decision. Tighten further and risk collision, or hold where they are and admit the block is failing. They hesitate, and that hesitation changes everything. Because in gray zone confrontations, the first side to pause is often the first side to understand the price of the next move. And Venezuela is beginning to see that steel hulls and silence by themselves are not enough. Not against a formation that has already made up its mind to hold course. What happens next will decide whether this encounter is remembered as posturing or as a hard lesson. At 6:41 local time, the situation reaches its most delicate stage. The Venezuelan ships are now well within visual range. Hull numbers can be read, bridge crews are visible. Through stabilized optics, even small movements on deck can be followed in real time. And still, no one opens fire, no one raises their voice, no one makes a rushed move. This is the point where discipline matters most. Inside the U.S. formation, command teams shift from assessment to control. Not force, but control. The goal is no longer simply to read intent. It is to manage risk while preserving both legal standing and tactical advantage. The carrier strike group maintains speed, heading, and spacing. Then, above the water, a helicopter lifts off smoothly, without sirens, without spectacle. The launch looks routine, but its purpose is clear. The aircraft does not rush toward the Venezuelan ships. Instead, it settles into a measured orbit, operating fully within international law. Presence, not provocation. From the air, the picture becomes sharper. The helicopter's sensors send live imagery back to the command center. Angles, spacing, deck activity, emissions. The Venezuelan formation is now being observed across multiple domains: surface, air, and electromagnetic. Every movement is time-stamped. Every course change is logged. What was once a tense encounter wrapped in uncertainty is now a fully documented interaction under constant observation. The Venezuelan ships respond without words, only with small adjustments. One reduces speed slightly, another drifts outward, widening its lane by a fraction. These are not retreats, but they are no longer advances either. They are recalculations. Blocking tactics depend on confidence. They require commitment, and commitment depends on certainty about what comes next. That certainty is beginning to fade. The U.S. posture does not change, but its message is unmistakable. The formation will not turn, it will not slow, and it will not be drawn into creating a different narrative. The closer the Venezuelan ships push, the smaller their margin for error becomes. At this range, one poorly judged helm order or one delayed throttle response could trigger a collision, an outcome no one wants and no one could easily explain away. The risk is no longer working in favor of the blocker. Inside the Venezuelan formation, coordination begins to show strain. One ship hesitates before matching a speed adjustment. Another holds position just a fraction too long. These are tiny details invisible to most viewers but obvious to trained eyes. This is what pressure looks like when it starts flowing in the opposite direction. For the U.S. Navy, this is the essence of gray zone control, forcing the other side to face the consequences of its own maneuvering without ever crossing into open force. No warnings beyond standard maritime hails, no dramatic signals, no gestures designed for headlines, just presence, just movement, just a clear refusal to yield. At 6:48, the Venezuelan lead ship alters course by a few degrees. Not enough to look like a full withdrawal, but enough to ease the immediate collision risk. It is the first visible crack in the blocking attempt. The others follow, not instantly, not dramatically, but inevitably. The arc begins to loosen, spacing opens up. The geometry that had been closing in to shape movement now starts to come apart. Overhead, the helicopter continues its orbit, steady and silent. Cameras keep rolling, the record keeps growing. This is the moment casual observers often miss. No dramatic climax, no public confrontation, no formal announcement. But the balance has changed. The Venezuelan attempt to control space without escalating has met a formation that understands time, optics, and law better than it fears intimidation. And the carrier strike group continues forward, not faster, not slower, but exactly as planned. Because the true strength on display here is not the power to strike first. It is the ability to make the other side understand that defeat can begin long before the first shot. And Venezuela is starting to realize that this encounter is no longer developing on its terms. What remains now is the aftermath, and that is where the mistake becomes impossible to miss. By 6:56 local time, the outcome is no longer in question. What started as a coordinated attempt to restrict movement has lost its shape. The Venezuelan formation is still there, still visible, but no longer unified. The arc that once seemed capable of narrowing the strike group's options now shows gaps, small at first, then steadily widening. This is how gray zone pressure unravels, not through a dramatic clash, but through exposure. The U.S. carrier strike group stays on its original course, moving directly through the space the block was meant to deny. The transit remains steady, deliberate, and unmistakable. No deviation, no hesitation. From the bridge, the message is never spoken aloud, but it is absolute. Overhead, the helicopter adjusts its orbit, repositioning to keep uninterrupted coverage as the geometry shifts. Sensors remain active. Cameras stay locked. The entire encounter continues to be documented from multiple angles and across multiple domains. Below, the Venezuelan ships begin making protective adjustments. One slows further, dropping back from the forward position it had held earlier. Another increases lateral spacing, opening a visible lane through which the strike group now advances. A third stays in place, caught between pressing forward and peeling away. There is no longer a single response, no longer a single line. That is the price of trying to impose control without full commitment. Blocking works only when every ship holds firm. The moment one vessel gives up space, the illusion starts to collapse. The formation no longer creates pressure, it starts absorbing it. Then, at last, the silence breaks. A Venezuelan transmission comes over the radio, formal, restrained, carefully worded. It refers to sovereign patrol activity near national waters. It calls for awareness. It does not demand a course change. It does not continue the earlier silence. It is not escalation, it is explanation. The U.S. reply is short, professional, and exactly by procedure. It restates the lawful transit through international waters. It notes that all movements are being recorded. It offers no concession and asks for none. The exchange is logged. At sea, posture matters more than language. The carrier strike group continues ahead, now clearly moving beyond the Venezuelan formation. The closest point of approach begins to widen. Risk declines. The pressure that once moved in one direction has now completely reversed. For Venezuela, this is the moment the reality sets in. They did not force a turn. They did not slow the formation. They did not gain control of the space. Instead, they revealed their method. Every maneuver has been observed, every hesitation has been captured, every adjustment has been time-stamped. In trying to demonstrate presence, they have given away predictability. Above, the helicopter begins its return leg, climbing slightly and widening its arc as the situation stabilizes. There is no rush, no sign of triumph. Only the quiet completion of a task. On the surface, the Venezuelan ships drift farther apart, settling into movements that look more like distant tracking than obstruction. The risk of collision has passed. The effort to shape movement has failed. From this point on, the encounter is effectively over, but the consequences are not. What remains is a detailed record, intent inferred through action, coordination tested under pressure, and a deliberate attempt to challenge a carrier strike group without crossing into open conflict. And that record will travel much farther than the ships themselves. For the U.S. Navy, this was never about winning a dramatic confrontation. It was about managing a dangerous scenario without losing control of the legal, tactical, or visual picture. The objective was achieved the moment the formation continued through without changing course. For Venezuela, the cost is less obvious, but far more lasting. They chose the timing with care. They chose the positioning with precision. They chose silence as leverage. And in doing so, they showed exactly how far they were prepared to go, and exactly where they would stop. That is the real mistake. Because in modern naval encounters, the side that exposes its limits without achieving its goal does more than lose the moment. It teaches the other side what to expect next time. And the next encounter will not begin with uncertainty. It will begin with lessons already learned. To an untrained viewer, it may seem as if nothing important happened. But in naval operations, outcomes are not judged by drama. They are judged by what each side reveals and what each side learns. Venezuela's mistake was not open aggression. It was a strategic error in judgment. They tried to influence a carrier strike group without fully committing to a higher level of confrontation. They relied on positioning, proximity, and silence to create pressure, expecting restraint to produce hesitation. It did not. Instead, restraint became the deciding advantage. From the moment the U.S. formation refused to adjust, every part of the encounter began working against Venezuela. Blocking tactics only succeed when the other side responds psychologically. When that response never comes, the pressure turns inward. And that is exactly what happened here. From a strategic perspective, Venezuela gained nothing. The carrier strike group did not divert. It did not reduce speed. It did not treat the maneuver as anything more than a routine maritime situation handled by procedure. There was no image of withdrawal, no visible pause, no narrative edge to claim afterward. What Venezuela did gain was exposure. Their maneuvering approach was revealed. Their coordination limits were tested. Their tolerance for risk was observed in real time. And all of it was documented. This is the part that rarely becomes the main story. Modern naval encounters are no longer only about ships and movement. They are about data, patterns, timing, reactions, and command cohesion under pressure. Venezuela revealed all of that without gaining a single concession in return. For the U.S. Navy, the encounter reinforced a doctrine shaped over decades, control through discipline. By maintaining course, speed, and legal clarity, the strike group denied the other side the reaction it was trying to provoke. No shots being fired does not mean no one came out behind. In fact, this is often how setbacks are recorded now, quietly, professionally, and permanently. The Venezuelan ships disengaged without incident, but they left behind a full operational signature. How they formed up, how they narrowed space, how long they maintained pressure before risk began to outweigh intent. These are not vague impressions. They are measurable patterns, and patterns shape future decisions. The timing made the miscalculation even more revealing. New Year's Day was likely meant to strengthen the signal, a symbolic moment when alertness might be assumed to be lower. Instead, it proved the opposite. Discipline does not take holidays. Readiness does not depend on the calendar. For viewers watching later, the encounter may appear controlled, even uneventful. For professionals, it was decisive, because the most dangerous mistake in gray zone operations is assuming that restraint means uncertainty. In reality, restraint backed by capability is often the clearest sign of control. Venezuela tried to create leverage without crossing the line. The U.S. Navy answered by denying that leverage altogether. That is why this was a mistake. Not because it failed dramatically, but because it failed cleanly. There was no major confrontation to rally around, no incident to protest, no outcome to reinterpret later. There was only a carrier strike group that continued exactly where it intended to go, and 5 warships that learned in silence that proximity by itself is not power. And as the horizon closes behind them, one truth remains. In modern naval operations, the side that stays calm is usually not hesitating. It is waiting. And the next encounter will begin with everything learned from this one.